afternoon. Well, I'm not following on in any way from what's gone before, although oddly enough IKM Emergent, the program I was also very involved with and I'm still writing up, really thought local knowledge and locally produced knowledge is absolutely central to its thinking, and related to that, how local knowledge is constitutive of development. So that was a really big area of what we were doing. Sarah was part of that and has commented already, but I'm going to go on to a completely different direction, which I guess is probably good. You're going to have plenty of variety in the show, and actually come back and perhaps address some of the points which were raised this morning about the narratives of the work you do in information management. I've been involved with the IARDI Information Management Working Group since I first met Sarah and Jeff and various others present here in Paris in 1998, I think. And it's really good to see such a big number of people. I know many of you come because of Eldis, but you know, in recent years there's been declining numbers coming to the IARDI Information Management Working Group meetings and declining energy. And the issue of funding, which came up this morning, is really affecting everyone and is a problem. And I thought I would come up with just a few ideas with the view of stimulating conversation about this. I've always felt that to a certain extent people have been a series of losing battles where first librarians and then bespoke IT providers and even university institutes themselves would always be claiming, oh, information and development, we own this, we're the experts in this, we'll do it for you. And everyone else, i.e. the customer and the donor and the reader and the user, weren't really happy with that. They're saying, no, we're part of this too. This is changing far more in society than just what you know about. And we don't want you to control it. But in the process, I think, people have become incredibly unaware and uncritical of some of the messes they've got themselves into, and I'm thinking this particularly on institutional development level. I'm not talking about the mess we're in as individual people. In the sort of over-reliance on simplistic technological solutions, which have already been mentioned, and particularly in relation to search and Google and social media, which the point Alan's just made. I think we're far too dependent on one or two big corporations. We're complacent about the hidden implications of such dependence, the narrowing of choice, the narrowing of a range of knowledges presented, the disappearance of local knowledges, even compared to the appalling situation at the end of the last century, and the centralization of power and income. And things like D groups are a wonderful but very, very rare exception to the trend. And also I think that people are insufficiently engaged with some of the core challenges of how development and information link and what needs to be done, and the need for creative collaboration with information professionals in meeting those challenges. So I wanted to just to briefly outline two areas of this, both of which were of interest to the IKM program, linked to it in some ways, where I think we could make strong arguments about the value of our work, which I understood is what we need to do. And the first is, I use the word curation, and I have been using it in this context for some time. There was a good recent discussion on KM for Dev about it. Having said that, it's also a horribly trendy word, and also suspicious about some of its current use. Certainly in the art world, some curators seem to think they're now the star of the show and that the artist is some sort of really fairly insignificant addition. But it is a word which describes three important roles that we as information managers and providers can play. And two of these are standard, but no less important for that. And we look after things and we take care of them. And in this era of ever-increasing volume, this I think becomes even more important. Already there's a lot of digital material created in the 90s and the noughties which is incredibly hard to find. And only the very biggest institutions have the resources to maintain the visibility of their historic material. And some of them don't even bother to do it. DFID, for one reason, for one example, it's very, very hard to find what DFID policy was even 10 years ago, let alone further. We make things visible and accessible, which obviously is also related to volume. It is related to the bias of search algorithms like Google, which aren't biased from an editorial point of view, but are biased to drive traffic and profit, not for own knowledge. We did an example of an alternative called IKM Vines as part of our project. We think of the bias, the problems of the arbitrary rules. That very good example Facebook offered us last week with the censorship of a Vietnam photograph. And in the context of development, then there's still the mass issues of connectivity and language, which are only partially resolved. And looking ahead to the sort of world of linked open data and the semantic web, there are a whole set of new things we have to take into account. Is qualitative information disappearing in the sea of data? And the really important question, for my way of thinking, of whether this semantic web, or whether the vocabulary is established to manage it, is all the starting point of a sort of technical scientific vocabularies, and are then the voices of ordinary people sort of technologically edited out of the whole process, because their words do not turn up in the taxonomy and the thesauri. And a small organisation I'm involved with called the Land Portal, works around land information, as it might suggest, has created a land vocabulary to link with FAO's AgriVoc, which is a big agricultural development thesaurus. But the Land Portal is, as far as I know, the first who actually taken its words from its vocabulary to do participatory meetings with local farmers' organisations in Southeast Asia, and getting 136 land terms from the official vocabulary, finding out their local synonyms in Khmer, Vietnamese and Thai. And the point is, if people aren't doing this work, then this new semantic web is just going to be completely exclusive of the voices of everyone we're supposed to be working on behalf of. So I think there are very strong arguments to do even these aspects of curation that we all routinely do. But I'd also like to suggest a third role of curation, one which we do less of in the development sector, which is the museum and exhibition one of actually actively displaying collections. Now, I don't actually mean by this having large development exhibitions, although if anyone would like to try it, I'm certainly up for helping. I'm more interested really in the potential of an information manager or archivist or librarian who really knows his or her stuff to curate informational spaces within which others can then work. I'm thinking, I mean, there's a number of these. We're thinking of complex, wicked issues and the attention they're gathering. Climate change would clearly be one. But I'm thinking more particularly here of interdisciplinarity as an approach to work. There's growing interest about, and it's of particular import to development studies. There's a forthcoming ERD paper which positions, as I understand it, or as I understood it a few months ago, it might have changed, really interdisciplinarity has been central to development studies, and indeed that being one of the key features of what development studies offers. And of course here we're in one of the largest institutes of development studies in the country, which has always been highly interdisciplinary. But I'm also very aware of new ones, like the institute that's set up in the University of Sheffield. It's a very, very small institute, with only I think 2 or 3 staff. What their job is to promote interdisciplinary work around development issues with all the other departments in the university. So they're like a facilitator of it. And so this is a very trendy word, lots of people talking about it again, but how many people actually know what real interdisciplinarity looks like and what potential it offers? It's one of those things, everyone claims to have done some of it, but I find that 9 times out of 10 what that means is someone has tackled an already identified problem with colleagues from a neighbouring discipline, maybe with whom they've worked in the past anyway, and there's not a real exploration of new possibilities or the full range of methodologies which could be applied. And there are a few examples of good practice. The King's Fund for Health, I would suggest, is one. STEPS here on the University of Sussex is another. But as far as I know, the institute where Sarah works in the VU in Amsterdam, the Athena Institute, is the only place in Europe where you can actually get an MA in interdisciplinary methodologies. So it's quite a sort of, we're really quite at the beginning of it. And the point which was particularly of interest to us in IKM was that if it's done really properly, then interdisciplinary work doesn't fit within current management tools at all, because it can't really be planned. It's always an emergent process, and there's been a guy called Alan Blackwell from Cambridge who's written a lot about that, very convincingly in my opinion. And then beyond that, in a development context, I would ask, is interdisciplinarity enough anyway? Because we also need to understand and communicate across other boundaries, not just between disciplines. So culture, gender, class, and status. And looking outside Europe, we see the sort of morphing of former linear models such as agricultural extension, from being very sort of top-down linear approaches to farmer-farmer exchanges, and similar processes in health education, moving from sort of one-way information teaching to interacting with populations, realizing that interaction is essential if anyone's behavior is going to change. So here we come across the realities of conflicting, working with conflicting worldviews and different ontologies, different approaches to being. And this, to me, really is where it also gets to the heart of understanding interdisciplinarity work. There's a guy called James Elkin wrote about visualizations in the university, and he was an art historian, or he is an art historian. Did some work at the University of Cork, looking at all the visualizations across the university. His departments, art history and media studies, or were ones which wrote about images. But they actually realized that 80–90% of the images produced and used in the university were in other departments, physics, medical science, blah, blah, blah. And no one was really studying this or knew what to do about it. And he had the temptation, as his job was to write about images, to make a start by doing so. And he realized that had he done so, he would have destroyed his investigation by imposing his disciplinary approach on what he wanted to be a multidisciplinary study. So it's very easy, even when you're trying to work in a new way, to carry the biases of your own knowledge with you. And you have to, I think, unlearn as well as learn. And in that context, I really think that mapping the informational assets of any new research practice space is a very positive and quite a neutral way of establishing the conversation, considering the ownership of the different bits of information, their origins, epistemic base, cultural influences, the political economy of the production of the knowledge. And if this is done by an information manager, someone who is like to be independent of the ensuing interdisciplinary negotiations and wrangles about who gets money to research what, I think that it could be a very potentially positive and interesting role for us as curators. Secondly, and more briefly, I want to return to another recurrent theme we had in IKM, which has also been mentioned by Jeff and others today, which is really about the fact that what we're trying to do is work in a development knowledge ecology. And that can be taken in two meanings of a word. I mean, an ecology can be a wild ecology where dog eats dog and you're my competitor, get out of the way, and there's the World Bank with all the resources. Or we can see it as a space in which we should and could work with ecological sensitivity. We can be the organic farmers of our profession. And this I think is particularly important to development because it's a knowledge landscape funded by public money and should function as a public good. And secondly, that you know, the ultimate adapters and beneficiaries of the knowledge produced should be the people whose lives are supposed to be improved by development. And this is currently, as we've been hearing today, is in so many cases not the case. And I think this actually leads the way into further arguments in favour of the way Eldis and its partners over the years has contributed to development, and why arguments in favour of its funding. Because information is consciously developed for a common good, I would argue, and is placed so that other people can find it, adapt it and use it, I would argue offers far better results and better value for money than information supplied as a commodity for a single instrumental purpose, which certainly, as I understand, DFID's current commissioning model is how they see it. You know, you get it for one purpose, it's used for that one purpose, it's put in a drawer, no one else sees it, there is no opportunity value created. And secondly, and I would put this even more importantly, although maybe this will make less impression on DFID, is that collaborative work around information, such as what I'm suggesting could be done for interdisciplinarity, leads to conversations about what is accurate, what is complete, what is meaningful. It offers, in Robert Chambers' words, triangulation. If it's done openly and with everyone's participation, it offers opportunity to test and discuss. And this process of creating knowledge through a collaboration, the conversations around that, in my view, they constitute development in their own right, beyond whatever knowledge and information is produced. So very finally, I would just like to say that being in an ecosystem, as I suggest we are, doesn't mean we're all equal. You know, as in the forest or in the waters, there are thousands and thousands of organisms dependent on the health of the key features, such as the forest cover or the water. And I'd really like to acknowledge the value of initiatives like Eldis and SciDev, I would say, as really vital parts of the information infrastructure. And if we're looking at it in an ecological sense, their existence contributes to everyone's capacity and capability, and their absence would diminish likewise. And finally, it's not easy to make these arguments, particularly when one's critical of donor policy and the politics behind them, if you just argue your own corner as part of a grant application and a one-on-one discussion with donors. So I see real value in having, being able to take a wider and more dispassionate overview, which is what Sarah and I are trying to do in writing up the history of the IKM programme, which I did promise a year ago when I was last here that would be published in 2016, but I think we are now looking 2017, perhaps. But more to the point, it's the value it's really what associations are for. So we could talk about, going back to the forest analogy, an amalgamated union of fairies, pixies, leprechauns and hobgoblins, or we could think about the value of the ERD Information Management Working Group and hope that it continues long into the future.